I heard my daughter-in-law say, "Don't approve the surgery. It's too expensive for someone her age." And in that moment, I realized I had already been written off long before that accident ever happened. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move a single finger. I just lay there, listening, letting every word settle into a place in my chest that had already been quietly cracking for years. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old, and up until that afternoon, I believed I still had a place in my son's life, in his home, in his decisions. I was wrong. If you're listening to me now, stay with me until the end, because what I discovered that day didn't begin in a hospital room, and it certainly didn't end there either. Just a few hours earlier, everything had felt ordinary in the way holidays often do when you've lived long enough to measure time by them. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite. I woke up before sunrise, as I always do, even without an alarm, my body still loyal to routines I built decades ago when my husband was alive. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort anymore, but echoes. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, hands resting on the counter, looking at the pumpkin pie I had baked the night before, perfectly set, the crust golden and even. I had wrapped it carefully, planning to bring it to Daniel's house, just like every year. Vanessa liked to pretend she could bake, but she never quite got the crust right. I never corrected her. I never corrected much of anything when it came to her. I got dressed slowly, choosing a soft gray sweater and the pearl earrings my husband gave me on our 40th anniversary. They felt heavier than usual that morning, though I couldn't say why. I checked the time. I wanted to leave early, avoid traffic, make sure I arrived before dinner so I could help set the table, even if Vanessa insisted she didn't need it. I still believed showing up early meant something. I still believed being useful meant being wanted. The drive to Daniel's house usually took about 40 minutes, just under 30 miles if traffic was light. I remember the sky that afternoon, pale and stretched thin like it. Couldn't quite decide what season it belonged to. I remember holding the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way Vanessa's voice had sounded on the phone the night before, polite but distant, like she was checking off a task rather than inviting family. "We'll see you tomorrow, Margaret," she had said, not Mom, not anything warmer than that. I told myself I was imagining things. I had been telling myself that for years. Somewhere along the highway, everything changed. Not in a dramatic way, not with noise or chaos the way people imagine when they think of accidents, but in a sudden, disorienting shift. One moment I was driving, thinking about whether I had brought enough cranberry sauce, and the next there was a jolt, a blur, and then silence. A deep, heavy silence that pressed against my ears. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't on the road anymore. The light above me was too bright, too white. The air smelled clean in a way that didn't belong to any home. I couldn't move much, just enough to feel the stiffness in my body, the weight of something unfamiliar beneath me. Voices came and went, distant at first, like they were passing through water. I heard someone mention my name. I heard the word procedure. I heard urgent. And then I heard her. "Vanessa." Clear. Steady. Controlled. "What are the risks?" she asked, her tone measured, almost clinical. A man answered, calm but firm, explaining something about timing, about the importance of acting quickly. I couldn't catch every word, but I understood enough. There was a decision to be made. My life, reduced to a conversation just a few feet away. Then came the sentence that settled everything. "I don't think it's necessary," Vanessa said. "She's already lived a long life. We should consider quality, not just prolonging things." There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. Not outrage. Just a quiet, professional silence. The kind that happens when someone hears something uncomfortable but not unexpected. I waited for Daniel's voice. I waited for my son to say something, to question, to hesitate, to remember that I was still here. Instead, there was nothing. Just the soft sound of someone shifting in their chair. That was when I understood. It wasn't just her decision. It was his silence that gave it weight. I lay there, eyes closed, breathing evenly, as if I hadn't heard a single word. But inside, something rearranged itself. Not broke, not shattered, just shifted into place with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. Every missed invitation, every polite excuse, every time I was told plans had changed after they had already happened. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't miscommunication. It was design. Careful, consistent, quiet. And now, here I was, reduced to a calculation. Cost, age, convenience. I didn't feel anger the way I thought I would. It was colder than that. Cleaner. Like stepping into air after realizing you've been holding your breath for far too long. I kept my eyes closed a little longer, listening as the conversation moved on without me, decisions made in tones that sounded reasonable, practical, almost kind if you didn't listen too closely. They thought I was unaware. They thought I was weak. They thought this moment would pass without consequence. They were wrong. Because as I lay there, still and silent, I made a decision of my own. If they believed my life could be measured and dismissed so easily, then everything I had spent decades building, would no longer follow the path they expected. I had spent a lifetime giving without question. That ended in that room. And what I would choose to give next would not be something they could take for granted ever again. I did not open my eyes until much later, not because I could not, but because I needed the time to think without them knowing I was thinking. And in that stillness I began to understand something I had refused to see for years, something that now felt impossible to ignore, because the truth is, moments like that do not come out of nowhere. They are built slowly, quietly, piece by piece, until one day they stand right in front of you, and you can no longer pretend they are anything else. And as I lay there listening to the distant hum of machines and footsteps passing in the hallway, I started going back through the last few years of my life, not with emotion, but with a kind of careful clarity that felt new to me, like I was finally reading a story I had been skimming for far too long. And the first thing that came to mind was a Sunday afternoon about 2 years ago when I had called Daniel just to hear his voice, something I used to do without thinking, something that used to feel natural. And I remember how quickly the call ended, how Vanessa had taken the phone and said they were busy, how she spoke with that same polite tone she always used, the kind that sounds respectful but leaves no room for anything real. And I remember standing in my kitchen after the call ended, holding the phone a little longer than necessary, telling myself that young families have their own lives, that I should not expect too much, that I should be grateful for what I had. And that was how it always began, with small explanations that made everything seem reasonable, even when it was not. And then there was the Christmas year after my husband passed, the first one without him, when I had asked what time dinner would be, and Vanessa told me they were keeping it simple, just the three of them, that it might be too much for me, that I should rest instead. And I remember agreeing, because at the time it sounded considerate, it sounded thoughtful, and I did not want to be the kind of mother who insisted on being included. But later that night, I saw the photos online, a full table, friends, laughter, decorations that I recognized because I had bought them years ago. And again I said nothing. I told myself there must have been a misunderstanding, that perhaps plans changed at the last minute, that it was not intentional. And then there were the smaller things, the ones that seemed too insignificant to question on their own, like how my visits became shorter, how I was no longer asked to stay overnight, how decisions about the house, about holidays, about family traditions were made without ever including me. And each time I adjusted, each time I stepped back a little further, believing I was being respectful, believing I was making things easier, when in reality, I was simply making space for myself to disappear. And lying in that hospital bed, hearing Vanessa speak about my life as if it were a line item on a list, I realized that none of it had been accidental. It had been consistent, deliberate, and patient, like someone slowly closing a door without ever letting it slam. And the hardest part was not what she said in that room. It was the fact that I finally understood how long she had been saying it without words, how long Daniel had allowed it to happen by choosing silence over discomfort. And I thought about the way he used to look at me when he was a boy, how he would reach for my hand without hesitation, how he would ask for my opinion on everything from school projects to the smallest decisions. And I wondered when that changed, when my voice became something optional, something easy to set aside. And as that thought settled in, I felt something inside me grow very still, not empty, but steady, like a surface that had finally stopped shaking. And for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to fix anything. I was not trying to understand them. I was simply seeing things as they were. And that clarity brought with it a kind of quiet strength that I had not expected. Because once you stop explaining away the truth, once you stop softening it to make it easier to accept, you are left with something solid, something you can actually stand on. And in that moment, I understood that whatever happened next would not be decided in that room. It would not be decided by Vanessa or by the doctors or even by Daniel. It would be decided by me, by what I chose to do with the knowledge I now had. And as the hours passed, and the sounds around me continued in their steady rhythm, I began to think not about what I had lost, but about what I still controlled, what still belonged to me, and how easily I had given that away in the past. Not because anyone forced me to, but because I believed that love required it, that being a good mother meant stepping back, meant trusting without question, meant accepting whatever place was offered to me. And now, for the first time, I was questioning that belief, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that something needed to change. And when I finally opened my eyes, slowly, carefully, as if nothing had shifted at all, I knew that the woman they thought they understood no longer existed in the way they expected, and that whatever came next would not follow the pattern they had grown so comfortable relying on. I did not speak right away when Daniel finally came into the room, because I wanted to see him before he saw me. I wanted to study the expression he thought no one else would notice. And when he stepped closer to the bed, I could tell immediately that something in him had already adjusted to the version of events Vanessa had decided. His shoulders were slightly tense, his eyes careful, not with grief, but with calculation, like he was preparing to explain something that had already been agreed upon. And when I turned my head just enough to meet his gaze, he forced a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes, the kind of smile people use when they are trying to keep things under control. "Mom, you are awake," he said softly, and I nodded once, slowly, as if even that movement required effort, even though my mind had never been clearer, and I watched him closely as he reached for the chair beside my bed, sitting down in a way that felt rehearsed, like he had been thinking about what he would say long before I opened my eyes. "There was a bit of a scare," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "but the doctors think it might be best to monitor things for now." And I let a small pause settle between us before I asked, very quietly, was there another option? Because I wanted to hear how he would say it, not just what he would say. And for a moment he looked down, just briefly, as if checking something inside himself, and then he answered. There was a possibility, but it carried risks, and I held his gaze, not pushing, not accusing, just waiting. And that was when Vanessa stepped into the room, her presence immediate and controlled as always, her posture straight, her expression composed, as if she had already decided what this moment would look like. "Margaret, you gave us quite a fright," she said, her voice smooth, almost warm if you did not listen too closely, and I turned my head slightly toward her, studying the way she stood just behind Daniel's shoulder, not beside him, not equal, but positioned in a way that allowed her to guide without appearing to lead. And I noticed how quickly Daniel glanced at her before speaking again, a small movement, but one that said more than anything else in the room. "Vanessa has been handling everything," he added, almost as if he needed to clarify roles, and I nodded again. Slower this time, letting the silence stretch just enough to make them both aware of it. I heard some of the conversation. I said finally, my voice steady, neither weak nor strong, just present, and I watched the way Vanessa's expression did not change, not even for a second, while Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his hand tightening on his knee. "The doctors explained the situation," Vanessa replied smoothly, stepping a little closer now, her tone measured. "Given your age and the potential complications, we thought it would be best to avoid anything too aggressive." And there it was again, the language of reason, of practicality, of decisions made for my benefit. And I let her words settle in the room before I asked, "We?" Because sometimes a single word is enough to reveal everything. And Daniel cleared his throat quietly before answering. "We discussed it together," and I could see it then, not in what he said, but in how quickly he said it, how easily the responsibility shifted into something shared, something safe, something that could not be traced back to a single choice. And I felt that same stillness settle deeper inside me, not cold, not distant, just clear, like water after the surface has stopped moving. "Of course," I said, my voice almost gentle, and I turned my gaze toward the window for a moment, letting them believe the conversation had settled, that I had accepted what they had decided. And in that small pause I could almost feel the shift in the room, the release of tension, the quiet assumption that things would continue as they always had, that I would not question, that I would not push, that I would remain in the place they had carefully created for me. And when I looked back at them, I allowed a faint smile to form, Not forced, not exaggerated, just enough to reassure them. "I trust you," I added softly, and I watched as Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he had been waiting for those exact words, as if trust, once spoken, made everything easier. And Vanessa gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes then, something that looked almost like confirmation, like a quiet acknowledgement, that things were proceeding exactly as planned. And I let that moment pass without interruption, because sometimes the most important decisions are made in the moments when no one believes anything has changed. And as the conversation moved on to smaller details, to discharge timelines and follow-up appointments, I listened carefully, not just to what was being said, but to what was being assumed, to the way my future was being outlined without ever asking me what I wanted. And I realized that this was not just about a single decision in a hospital room. It was about a pattern that extended far beyond it, a pattern that would continue exactly as it had unless I chose to change it. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel the need to correct them, to defend myself, or to prove anything, because I understood something now that I had not understood before, that the most powerful response is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to step out of the role they expect you to play. And as Daniel stood up to adjust the blanket at the foot of my bed, his movements careful but distant, and Vanessa checked something on her phone with practiced efficiency, I made a decision that neither of them could see, not yet, but one that would change everything that came after. And I held on to that decision with the same calm certainty that had settled over me since I first heard her voice in that room. Because this time, I was not going to give them the version of me they had grown so comfortable overlooking. They stayed only a little while longer after that conversation, long enough to make it look like concern, long enough to feel appropriate. And then, one by one, they stepped out of the room. First Vanessa with a quiet excuse about taking a call, then Daniel lingering just a second longer as if he wanted to say something else, but could not quite find the words. And when he finally left, the room became still again in a way that felt different from before, not empty, but clear, like a space that finally belonged to me again. And I turned my head slightly toward the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the floor in long, pale lines. And for the first time since the accident, I allowed myself to think not about what had just happened, but about what would happen next, because that was the part no one else in that room had considered. Not really. They had made a decision about my body, about my care, about what was worth doing and what was not, but they had not considered what I might decide in return. And that realization settled into me with a kind of quiet certainty that felt almost unfamiliar, as if I had spent so many years reacting that I had forgotten what it meant to choose. And I let my hand rest lightly against the blanket, feeling the texture beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something simple and real. And I began to think through the practical details, not with urgency, not with anger, but with the same steady patience I had used my entire life to build everything they now took for granted. Because the truth is, nothing I had came quickly, not the house, not the savings, not the sense of stability I had worked so hard to create after my husband passed. And as I lay there, I realized how easily I had assumed those things would simply pass on in the way they were expected to, how I had never truly questioned whether the people I trusted with them deserved that trust. And now, for the first time, I was questioning everything. And it did not feel chaotic the way I thought it might. It felt precise, almost methodical, like I was finally organizing something that had been left unattended for far too long. And I thought about the documents I had signed years ago, the accounts Daniel had access to, the small decisions I had allowed him to make on my behalf. Because it seemed easier, because it seemed like the natural progression of things, and I understood now that ease had come at a cost, a quiet transfer of control that I had never fully acknowledged. And I closed my eyes briefly, not to rest, but to focus, to map out what needed to be done once I left this place. Because I knew I would leave. I knew that with a certainty that did not need to be explained. And as that thought settled in, there was a soft knock at the door, followed by a voice I did not recognize at first, calm and measured, asking if it was a good time to come in. And when I turned my head slightly, I saw a woman standing just inside the doorway, her posture relaxed but attentive, a folder held neatly in her hands, and she introduced herself as a patient advocate, someone assigned to help ensure that I understood my options. And I watched her for a moment, taking in the way she spoke directly to me, not over me, not around me, but to me, and it struck me how different that felt from the conversations I had overheard earlier, how simple it was, and how rare it had become. "I would like to hear from you," she said gently, "about how you would like to proceed." And for a brief moment, I felt something shift again, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, steady way that reminded me of who I had been before I started stepping back from my own life. And I nodded once, slowly, and told her I would appreciate that, and as she moved closer, pulling the chair beside my bed forward, I noticed the way she waited, not rushing, not filling the silence, just allowing space for me to speak when I was ready. And that small act, that simple patience, felt more respectful than anything I had experienced in that room all day. And I began to answer her questions carefully, choosing my words with intention, not revealing everything, not yet, but enough to establish something important, that I was present, that I was capable, that I was not someone to be spoken for without consent. And as we talked, I could feel the shape of a plan forming more clearly in my mind, not fully defined, but solid enough to hold. And when she finally stood to leave, handing me a card with her name and a number I could call directly, I thanked her, genuinely, because in that moment she had given me something I had not realized I needed, a reminder that I still had a voice in all of this. And after she left, I lay back against the pillow, the room quiet once more, but no longer uncertain, and I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, letting everything settle into place, because now I understood not only what had been taken from me, but what I still had, and more importantly, what I intended to do with it. And for the first time since that voice reached me through the haze of that hospital room, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath that felt almost like relief, not because anything had been resolved, but because the direction had finally changed, and this time, I was the one choosing where it would lead. That night was the first time I did not wait for Daniel or Vanessa to return before making a decision, and it felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a role I had quietly given up without realizing it. But the more I allowed myself to sit with it, the more natural it became, because the truth is, I had always been capable of managing my own affairs. I had simply chosen not to, believing that trust meant surrender, believing that love meant stepping aside, and now, lying in that hospital bed with the soft hum of machines surrounding me, I began to take that space back piece by piece, starting with something simple, something they would not even notice until it was far too late. I reached for the small table beside my bed where the card the patient advocate had left was resting, and I picked it up slowly, turning it over once as if I were simply reading it again, but in reality, I was considering what it represented. Access, independence, a direct line that did not pass through anyone else. And I held it for a moment longer before placing it back down exactly where it had been, because I understood something important now. That timing mattered, that acting too quickly would only alert them, and I had no intention of giving them that advantage. Instead, I chose patience, the same patience I had used my entire life. But this time it would serve a different purpose, and when the nurse came in later that evening to check on me, I spoke with her in a way I had not spoken all day, calm, clear, and direct, asking questions not just about my condition, but about my records, my authorization, who currently had access to what information. And I watched carefully as she answered, noting the small details, the procedures, the assumptions built into the system. And I realized how easily decisions could be shaped by whoever appeared to be in charge, and how often that role was given rather than confirmed. And I made a quiet note to change that, not immediately, not in a way that would draw attention, but soon, very soon, because control, once understood, becomes difficult to ignore. And later, when the room grew quiet again and the hallway lights dimmed, I allowed my thoughts to move beyond the hospital, beyond the immediate situation, and into the life that waited outside, the house that still stood exactly as I had left it, the accounts that still carried my name, the documents that still reflected choices I had made years ago under very different assumptions. And I began to consider how each of those things would need to be revisited, not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because what had happened in that room was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision, and decisions have consequences, even when they are made quietly, even when they are wrapped in careful language and polite explanations. And as I thought through each step, each small adjustment that would need to be made, I felt a sense of calm settle deeper into me, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing, even if no one else can see it yet. And I realized that this would not be a confrontation. It would not be loud or dramatic. There would be no arguments, no accusations, because none of that would change what had already been revealed. Instead, this would be something far more effective, a quiet redirection, a shift in structure that would leave no room for interpretation. And when I finally allowed my eyes to close for a short rest, it was not out of exhaustion, but out of certainty, because for the first time in a long time, I was not reacting to what others had decided. I was preparing for what I would decide next. And when morning came and the light returned to the room in that soft, steady way it always does, I opened my eyes with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, as if something fundamental had settled into place overnight. And when Daniel and Vanessa arrived again later that morning, carrying with them the same careful expressions, the same measured concern, I greeted them with the same calm demeanor they had come to expect, answering their questions, listening to their updates, allowing the conversation to move exactly as they anticipated, because there was no reason to change that yet, no reason to reveal anything before it was fully ready. And as Vanessa spoke about follow-up care and timelines, her voice steady, her tone confident, I watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with understanding, because now I could see the pattern clearly. The way she positioned herself as the decision-maker, the way Daniel deferred without even realizing it. And I let that pattern continue for just a little while longer, because sometimes the most effective way to change something is to let it reveal itself completely before you move. And when the conversation slowed and Daniel stepped out briefly to speak with a nurse, Vanessa remained by the window, checking her phone, her posture relaxed, certain, and I turned my head slightly toward her, meeting her gaze just long enough to offer a faint, composed smile, the kind she had seen from me countless times before, the kind that had always signaled acceptance. And I watched as she returned it without hesitation, confident that nothing had shifted, confident that everything remained exactly as it had been. And I held that moment for just a second longer before looking away again, because she did not need to know that everything had already changed. Not yet. And as the day continued and the routines of the hospital carried on around us, I remained exactly as they expected me to be, calm, cooperative, trusting. While beneath that surface, every decision I had once left to others was quietly returning to where it had always belonged. And this time, I had no intention of giving it away again. By the third day, they had already settled into a rhythm that no longer required discussion. And that was when I knew it was time to begin making changes they could not anticipate, not by confronting them directly, not by questioning what had already been decided, but by quietly stepping outside the structure they believed was fixed. And it began with something small, something that would seem routine to anyone watching. I asked the nurse that morning if I could review my chart, my full chart, not just the summary they had been discussing in front of me, and she hesitated only briefly before agreeing, because there was no reason to refuse. Not when the request came from the patient herself. And as she placed the tablet in my hands, guiding me through the sections with calm professionalism, I paid close attention not only to the medical details, but to the authorizations listed at the bottom, the names, the permissions, the quiet assumptions embedded in each line. And there it was. Exactly as I expected, Vanessa listed as primary contact, decision authority, her name appearing again and again in places where mine should have been the only one that mattered. And I did not react. I did not question it out loud. I simply nodded, thanked the nurse, and handed the device back with the same composed expression I had maintained since the moment I opened my eyes. Because reacting too soon would only complicate what needed to be done carefully. And after she left, I reached once more for the card the patient advocate had given me. This time not just holding it, but using it. Dialing the number slowly, listening to the quiet ring on the other end, and when she answered, her voice steady and familiar, I introduced myself again, my tone calm, deliberate, and I asked a simple question, one that carried far more weight than it appeared to. I would like to update my medical decision authority. And there was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if she understood immediately what that request meant, and she responded without hesitation, explaining the process, the forms, the requirements, all of it straightforward, all of it entirely within my control. And as she spoke, I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper, because this was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It had only been left unattended, and within an hour, she was in my room again, this time with documents. Simple, direct, requiring nothing more than my signature and confirmation, and I read each line carefully, not rushing, not assuming, because I understood now how much could be hidden in what seems routine, and when I finished, I signed, my hand steady, my name clear, reclaiming something that had never truly belonged to anyone else. And she nodded once, collecting the papers with a small, professional smile, assuring me that the changes would take effect immediately, that all future decisions would require my direct approval unless I chose otherwise, and I thanked her again, not with unnecessary emotion, but with quiet acknowledgement, because in that moment, something fundamental had shifted, not visibly, not in a way that would alarm anyone walking into the room, but in a way that would change every decision moving forward. And later that afternoon, when Daniel and Vanessa returned, they noticed nothing at first. The room looked the same. I was in the same position, the same calm expression on my face, and the conversation began as it always did: updates, plans. Vanessa outlining the next steps with practiced ease, her confidence unbroken, her tone steady, and I listened, just as I had before, allowing her to speak without interruption, allowing the pattern to continue just long enough for it to reveal itself once more. And then, when she paused to confirm a detail with the nurse who had just entered the room, something changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough. The nurse glanced at me first before answering, a small shift, almost unnoticeable, but I saw it. And so did Vanessa, even if she did not understand it yet. "We will need to confirm with Mrs. Collins directly," the nurse said politely, her tone professional, her eyes meeting mine instead of Vanessa's, and there was a brief silence, just a second, but long enough for the air in the room to tighten slightly, and I turned my head slowly toward them, meeting their gaze with the same composed calm I had maintained all day. "That is correct," I said, my voice even, not raised, not defensive, just clear, and I watched as Vanessa's expression remained controlled, but something behind it shifted, something subtle, like a calculation that no longer aligned the way it had before, and Daniel looked between us, his confusion quiet but visible, as if he had not expected the dynamic to change, as if he had assumed everything would continue exactly as it had been, and I allowed that moment to settle without explanation, because explanations were no longer necessary. The structure had already changed, whether they fully understood it or not. And as the conversation moved forward, slower now, more careful, I remained exactly as I had been. Calm, composed, cooperative, but no longer passive, and that difference, though small on the surface, carried a weight they would begin to feel more clearly with each passing decision, because this time, nothing would be assumed, nothing would be decided without me. And for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer observing my own life from the outside. I was standing firmly within it, and everything that followed would be shaped by that one quiet change. The change did not happen all at once, and that was what made it so effective, because nothing that looks sudden is ever truly stable, but something that shifts quietly, step by step, often goes unnoticed until it is already complete. And over the next day, I began to see the difference not just in what was said, but in what was no longer assumed. Every question now came to me first. Every decision paused just long enough to include me, and while it might have appeared like a small adjustment to anyone else, I understood exactly what it meant. The center had shifted, and once that happens, everything else must adjust around it whether people are ready or not. And Vanessa felt it immediately, even if she did not acknowledge it directly, because the confidence she carried into the room was no longer as effortless as before. It was still there, still carefully maintained, but now it required attention, small corrections, subtle shifts in tone, and I watched those changes closely, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was not about winning anything. It was about seeing things as they truly were and responding accordingly. And that afternoon, as we discussed discharge plans, I noticed the first real crack in the pattern they had relied on for so long. The doctor explained that I would likely be able to return home within a few days, with some follow-up care and adjustments. Nothing extreme, nothing beyond what could be managed with proper support. And before Vanessa could respond, Before she could position herself as the one to interpret and decide, I spoke first, my voice steady, measured. "I will be returning to my home," I said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a simple statement. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they had not expected it. And Daniel looked at me with a kind of quiet uncertainty, as if he were trying to reconcile this version of me with the one he had grown used to, while Vanessa's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened slightly, calculating, adjusting. "That might not be the most practical option right now," she replied, her tone still polite, still controlled, but there was a new edge beneath it, something more deliberate. "It would be easier if you stayed with us for a while, at least until you are fully settled." And I met her gaze without hesitation, holding it just long enough to make it clear that this was not a conversation I intended to hand over. "I appreciate the offer," I said calmly, "but I prefer to be in my own home." And again, I did not explain, I did not justify, because I had learned something important over the last few days, that explanations often invite negotiation, and I was no longer negotiating my place in my own life, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not uncertain, it was not confused, it was simply unfamiliar, like a space they had not prepared for. And eventually Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he did not fully understand. "If that is what you want, Mom," he said, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice, not resistance, but adjustment, the slow process of recognizing that the structure he had relied on was no longer intact. And Vanessa did not respond immediately. She simply shifted her weight slightly, her posture still controlled, but no longer as relaxed. And I could see the questions forming behind her composed expression, questions about what had changed, about what she might have missed, and I allowed those questions to remain unanswered, because the answers would reveal themselves in time, not through explanation, but through action. And later, when they stepped out of the room again, leaving me alone with the quiet rhythm of the hospital, I reached for my phone for the first time since I had been admitted, not because I needed distraction, but because there were things that needed to be set in motion beyond these walls. And as I scrolled through my contacts, I paused on a name I had not called in quite some time, someone I had trusted for years, someone who had helped me organize my affairs after my husband passed, and I pressed the call button without hesitation, listening to the steady ring on the other end. And when the voice answered, familiar and professional, I introduced myself simply. "This is Margaret Collins," I said, my tone clear, direct. "I would like to schedule a meeting as soon as possible to review and update all of my documents." And there was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if he understood immediately that something had prompted this call, and he responded without delay, offering a time, confirming availability. And as we spoke, I outlined just enough to make it clear that this was not routine, that there were changes to be made, significant ones. And when the call ended, I set the phone back down beside me, the screen going dark as the room settled into its quiet again, and I allowed myself a moment to sit with what I had just set in motion, not with doubt, not with hesitation, but with the same steady certainty that had guided me since that first moment in the hospital room. Because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done, it was about defining what would happen next. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not waiting to be included, I was deciding what would be included, and who would be part of it. And as that realization settled fully into place, I felt something shift again, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, lasting way that told me this change was not temporary. It was not situational. It was something deeper, something that would carry forward long after I left this room. And this time, there would be no returning to what it had been before. The morning I was discharged, everything moved with a kind of practiced efficiency that felt almost detached from the weight of what had already been set in motion. Forms were signed, instructions were repeated, timelines were outlined in careful, measured language, and I followed each step with the same calm attention I had maintained for days, not rushing, not questioning unnecessarily, because the decisions that mattered had already been made elsewhere. And as I sat at the edge of the bed, fully dressed for the first time since I arrived, I took a moment to look around the room, not with attachment, but with recognition. This was where everything had shifted, not because of what was done to me, but because of what I chose to see. And that difference was something I would carry with me long after I walked out of that door. And when Daniel arrived to take me home, he greeted me with the same careful concern, his movements attentive, his tone gentle, as if he were trying to restore something that had quietly slipped away, and I allowed it. Not because I believed it changed anything, but because I understood that people often continue patterns long after they have stopped being effective, and Vanessa followed just behind him, composed as always, her presence controlled, her expression neutral, but there was a subtle tension there now, something that had not been there before, a slight hesitation in the way she observed me, as if she were still trying to determine where the shift had occurred, and I met her gaze briefly, offering the same polite acknowledgement I always had, giving her nothing more, nothing less, and together we moved through the final steps of discharge, the nurse reviewing instructions, confirming follow-up appointments, and this time, every question came to me first, every answer required my voice, and I could feel the difference settle into the space between us, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and when we finally stepped outside, the air felt different in a way that is difficult to explain, not fresher, not lighter, just clearer, like something had been removed that I had grown so used to carrying that I no longer noticed its weight. And Daniel helped me into the car, adjusting the seat carefully, asking if I was comfortable, and I nodded once, thanking him, my tone steady. And as he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, Vanessa slid into the passenger seat without a word, her posture straight, her gaze forward, and for a moment, none of us spoke. The engine started, the car moved, and the silence stretched in a way that felt different from before, not heavy, not uncertain, just unfilled, as if the usual roles had not yet found their place again. And I let that silence remain, because there was no need to rush into conversation that no longer fit. And as we drove, I watched the familiar streets pass by, each one carrying memories that felt slightly altered now, not because they had changed, but because I had. And when we finally pulled into my driveway, Daniel turned off the engine and sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, as if he were considering something he had not yet decided how to say. And then he looked at me, his expression softer than before, but still uncertain. "Are you sure you do not want to stay with us for a few days?" he asked, his voice careful, and I met his gaze with the same calm steadiness I had carried since the hospital. "I am sure," I replied simply, and I did not add anything else, because there was nothing else to add, and he nodded slowly, accepting it, even if he did not fully understand it. And when we stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, I reached into my bag for the key, the same key I had used for years, and as I turned it in the lock and pushed the door open, I felt something settle into place in a way that was both quiet and absolute. This was my space, my decisions, my life, and for the first time in a long time, there was no question about that, and inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, the same furniture, the same photographs, the same small details that had always made this house feel like mine, and I stepped in slowly, taking a moment to let the familiarity surround me, not with nostalgia, but with clarity, because now I understood what it represented, not just a place, but a foundation I had built and maintained. And as Daniel carried my bag inside and set it near the door, he looked around briefly, as if seeing it through a different lens. And Vanessa remained just inside the entryway, her gaze moving quietly across the room, assessing, calculating, and I could see it then, the subtle shift in her posture, the realization that this environment was not one she controlled, not one she could easily shape, and I allowed that realization to remain exactly where it was, unspoken, unchallenged, because it did not need to be addressed directly to have its effect. And after a few more moments of quiet conversation, of small, careful exchanges that carried none of the weight they once might have, they prepared to leave, Daniel offering to return later, to check in, to help with anything I might need. And I thanked him, sincerely but without dependency. And Vanessa gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but her eyes lingering for just a second longer than before, as if trying to read something she could not quite define. And then they were gone, the door closing softly behind them, and the house returned to its natural quiet. And I stood there for a moment, alone but not uncertain, and I walked slowly into the living room, setting my bag down, taking in the space not as something I might lose, but but as something I had already reclaimed, and I knew that what I had set in motion would not unfold all at once. It would take time, careful steps, deliberate choices, but that was something I understood well, because I had spent a lifetime building things that lasted, and this would be no different. And as I moved through the house, opening a window, letting in the late afternoon light, I felt that same steady clarity settle once more, not temporary, not fragile, but firm. And whatever came next would not be decided by assumption or convenience or quiet dismissal. It would be decided by me, in my time, and on my terms. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty, and over the next few days I moved through it slowly, deliberately, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel every part of it again on my own terms. The kitchen where I had spent decades preparing meals that were meant to bring people together. The living room where holidays had once felt full and certain. The small details that had never changed even when everything else had. And with each step, the clarity that had begun. In that hospital room settled deeper into something steady and lasting. Because now I understood that what I had built was never dependent on anyone else's approval. Only on my willingness to maintain it. And that was something I would no longer take for granted. And on the third morning after I returned home, I prepared for the meeting I had scheduled, not with urgency, but with intention, selecting a simple outfit, gathering the documents I had kept organized for years, placing them neatly into a folder that had once felt like a formality and now felt like something far more significant. And when I arrived at the office, the familiarity of the space was almost comforting, not because it reminded me of the past, but because it represented continuity, a structure that had remained stable even as everything else shifted. And when I sat across from the man who had helped me organize my affairs after my husband passed, I did not begin with explanations. I did not recount what had happened in the hospital, because none of that was necessary. Instead, I spoke clearly, directly, outlining what I wanted changed, what I wanted removed, what I wanted protected. And as I spoke, I could see the understanding settle in his expression, not surprise, not concern, but recognition, as if he had seen this kind of shift before. The moment when someone decides to take full ownership of what they had once shared without question. And we went through each document carefully, line by line, adjusting details that had once seemed permanent, revising decisions that no longer reflected the reality I now saw clearly. And when we reached the final pages, the ones that defined where everything would go and to whom, I paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because this was not simply about removing names or changing percentages. It was about aligning everything with the truth I had finally accepted. And when I signed the last document, my hand steady, my name clear, I felt no rush of emotion, no sense of loss, only a quiet, settled certainty that what had been unclear was now defined. And when the meeting ended and I stepped back outside, the air felt the same as it had the day I left the hospital, clear, steady, unchanged by anything except my understanding of it. And later that week, I invited Daniel and Vanessa over, not for a holiday, not for an occasion, but for something simpler, something that would appear ordinary on the surface. And when they arrived, their expressions carried that same careful balance I had seen before. Daniel attentive but uncertain, Vanessa composed but watchful, and I welcomed them in with the same calm politeness I had always shown, offering coffee, guiding them into the living room, allowing the conversation to begin in the familiar way, light, cautious, as if we were all adjusting to something none of us had fully named. And I let that continue just long enough for the room to settle, for the rhythm of normalcy to establish itself. And then, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, I reached for the folder I had placed on the table beside me and opened it slowly, the sound of the paper quiet but distinct in the stillness of the room. And I looked at Daniel first, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with clarity. I have updated all, I said, my voice even, measured, and I watched as his expression shifted slightly. Confusion first, then something closer to concern, while Vanessa remained still, her gaze fixed on the folder, her posture unchanged but her attention sharpened. And I continued, not rushing, not explaining beyond what was necessary. Everything I have will now go to the person who chose to protect my life when it mattered most. And I let the words settle, not elaborating, not clarifying, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. That truth does not require repetition to be understood, and the silence that followed was different from any we had shared before. It was not uncertain, not hesitant, but defined, as if the space between us had finally taken on a shape that could not be ignored. And Daniel looked at me as if searching for something more, some explanation that would make the statement easier to place, while Vanessa's expression remained controlled. But there was a stillness in it now that had not been there before, not confidence, not calculation, but something quieter, something closer to realization. And I did not add anything else. I did not need to, because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, not just in that moment, but in every decision that had led to it. And I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table. And for the first time since that day in the hospital, I felt no need to observe, no need to analyze, because the pattern had been completed, the shift fully realized, and whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been taken from me, but by what I had chosen to reclaim. And in that quiet, steady room, I understood that this was not an ending. It was simply the moment everything finally aligned with the truth I had seen all along.